get started. Okay. So tonight, probably our shortest chapter segment that we've actually attempted to try to break down. And part of that's just because of the way the natural division within the book falls out. And that'll make more sense next week with respect to the last bit that we will cover to finish off Leviticus before we jump over into Numbers. So just a few things to remind us of, to keep into perspective as we finish out these final 2 weeks in the last half of the book. And that is considering where Leviticus is within the canon, but at the same time, the contents of the book, it's very easy to chalk it up to the realm of legislation, law codes. There's a whole awful lot of do's and don'ts with respect to the material here. However, there is definitely an established narrative flow to the book, which we laid out the first week we looked at this. It's been a little while. So tonight will actually remind us of where we are literarily in the book as far as the narrative flow of the text. And it's important to keep those things in mind because failing to recognize those benchmarks for what they are will certainly set one up for failure when it comes to interpreting what the contents of this book are and the reason why they are given. All right? And coming right off the heels of Exodus 40 and the problem, it's a bit of a crisis that's presented there with respect to the idea that the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, remember that's a slightly different term than the other Hebrew word that is often used to be translated into English as tabernacle, which is mishkan, but that signifies a dwelling place. It's one and the same structure, but that certainly serves two different purposes. A dwelling place for God, but it's also at the same time the place where Israel will cultically meet with God in order to enter into His presence. As the psalmist reflects in Psalm 24, be able to ascend unto the mountain of God. And we keep all of this in perspective with the idea of the flow of the story from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and what God ideally established there and how He has circled back to that very storyline with what He has done in His commissioning of Abram, becoming Abraham, all of the laydown of these moments of covenant speech with respect to the dialogue that he and his friend Abraham are sharing with each other. We're getting some insight into that relationship, but the moments that Moses preserves for us in the narrative is strictly for the sake of us understanding what God is doing as part of the larger picture. Oftentimes, with our Western mindset, we have the tendency to put ourselves in the driver's seat, looking at personal application above communal corporate application. The paradigm needs to be completely inverted. We need to think about it from the way ancient Israelites would have appreciated this, which is always with community first in mind, if there's ever even a moment for the person to enter into that space on what we would often call the devotional plane, where we're trying to glean something from this as goes, what do I do with this? And how does this apply to my life and whatnot? That is an entirely Western construct that in most cases winds up to, especially in the Old Testament, leading us to either inappropriate conclusions or just a moment of frustration where we're kind of stuck with where we are in the narrative and our interpretation and appreciation of these texts, thinking, well, I'm not really sure what that means. Maybe at some point I'll get smarter with it. Or I don't know, maybe it was just not meant for us to really truly know. But that's ludicrous with respect to the idea of why God purposefully and functionally gave these texts to Israel. So as we had ended last week with some more of that legislative speech, we started with chapter 10, looking at the unfortunate incident with respect to Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's oldest two sons, and how God's holiness breached out against them and consumed them in fire the way He had consumed the offerings that were there on the altar. Now that's important for us to remember as well, because the events of what transpires in chapters 8 and 9 answer the problem in Exodus 40, because neither Moses or Aaron can go into the Ohel Moed because of God's presence permeating that space. By virtue of that now, with remembering the fact that those proper offerings that were necessary for the installation and consecration of Aaron and his sons, Aaron and Moses can now go in. They get to ascend the mountain of the Lord. And then the same happens when Aaron offers rightly for the people. They now get to ascend unto the mountain of the Lord, at least figuratively, in the cultic presence of the new Adam figure. Aaron working in that garden space that is the tabernacle structure. And because of that, God answers approvingly with fire coming down from heaven, consuming the offerings. And then immediately, just like Genesis 3 follows Genesis 1 and 2, with God putting the man in the garden and then they fall, these two men disobediently attempt to try to lay claim to perhaps what is not theirs. Speculation aside, seemingly the best fit for the scenario was that they perhaps were attempting to try to penetrate the most holy space, hence the reason why God begins chapter 16, as we're going to discuss tonight, with what exactly is the regulation for how and when the newly consecrated Adam figure is supposed to approach the Lord. When does he get that chance, under what circumstances, and how is he to enter so that there is no repeat of this episode again? But between chapter 10 and where we'll pick up tonight in chapter 16, we had some more breakdown of the legislation, the law that's given as to certain things that are to be done to make sure that the camp and the people within maintain a position of being ceremonially accepted by God and can enter into that space when they obligingly or willfully observe all the commands laid down in chapters 1 through 7. When they want to approach the Lord with burnt offerings, fellowship offerings, perhaps the most common of what would be laid on the altar, certainly in the appropriate circumstances when unintentional sin has been committed and sin offerings need to be given, and of course grain offerings coupling all of these various things, that they can do that because they are clean, they are not impure. We have all kinds of things that were said that may disqualify them for that, albeit temporarily. Tonight we're going to get into some slightly more serious circumstances in which that might not be the case. But before we jump into chapter 16, I recycled this slide from 2 weeks ago because obviously the content of chapter 16 deals exclusively with the Day of Atonement, understanding from the New Testament perspective and how the author of the letter to this conglomerate of Messianic Jews that is called Hebrews for us is probably the only person in the New Testament that makes any real reference to this in a direct way, and obviously spends, as you can see from the various citations in these chapters, mid-portion of the letter, 5 through 10, all these references to the Day of Atonement. Having said that, though, the one thing that we want to make sure that we're keeping in proper perspective is that while we are looking back through the lens of what Jesus has done and his finished work through the cross, we are not taking New Testament ideals and transposing them on this Old Testament concept of the Day of Atonement, such that what we see Jesus doing there on the cross must be exactly what was happening there, minus the fact it's a human being who is offered up on the cross as opposed to various animals. Instead, in order to better understand and appreciate the cross, we should put ourselves in the perspective of these ancient Israelites, appreciating because they are living it out in real space and time, or reading these events later on in future generations, and obviously still living out the observance of these things in real space and time when there is a functional temple for them to do that. Obviously, there are spurts of centuries or decades, depending upon what time period you're talking about, where there is no temple for them to be able to do so. But what I mean by that is it's not a one-for-one. It's not looking at what Jesus has done and just saying that God has substituted Christ for what the temple itself was doing through things like the Day of Atonement or even Passover in itself. It's a multi-dimensional picture that lets us see what the efficacious work of Jesus was doing when he offered himself up. That's way more than just what the Day of Atonement was meant to achieve and could achieve on its own. If that doesn't make sense, then hopefully it will as we move through this. So here we go. Let's go ahead and jump into chapter 16 and read the first 22 verses, our longest portion of text tonight. So just bear with me as I try to move through this quickly. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of two of Aaron's sons when they approached the presence of the Lord and died. So let's situate ourselves in our mind when this is happening. Presumably this is happening the very moment or shortly thereafter, more likely, when these two men have died in the sacred space. And distant relatives, cousins, are the ones who are disposing of their remains. But this is right around that time in which these words are being passed from the Lord through Moses to Aaron. Verse 2. The Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he may not come whenever he wants into the holy place behind the curtain in front of the mercy seat on the ark, or else he will die, because I appear in the cloud above the mercy seat. I think a lot of us perhaps operate under the presumption that Aaron had been doing this on a daily basis. That's not the case. Aaron has seemingly never had the chance to go into the most holy place. If we appreciate what the implications of verse 1 are, and considering that these attach to the events of what transpired in chapter 10, which was seemingly the exact same day in which Moses was assembling the tabernacle proper, per what was going on in Exodus chapter 40. So we have to keep those benchmarks in proper perspective, else we'll be thinking that Aaron, for some indefinite period of time, had just been waltzing on in to the Holy of Holies every single day and offering up whatever sacrifices he thought were appropriate. The Bible doesn't seem to intimate that. Okay? Moving on. Verse 3. All right, let's finish verse 2. Curtain in front of the mercy seat on the ark, or else he will die, because I will appear in the cloud above the mercy seat. That's important for us to understand too. The word appear there is the same word that is used in many various contexts in which there's an actual physical appearance of the Lord through some sort of theophanic expression. In other words, what I'm saying is that a lot of times you and I seem to have this impression that it was just a cloud of sort that was actually above the mercy seat when Aaron walked in there. But more likely, considering the idea that this word is used for moments in which the angel of the Lord might appear, or the Lord himself has appeared as he did in the context of Genesis 18 when he is coming to tell Abraham at that point, what it is he intends to do as he sends his angels out into Sodom and Gomorrah and then bring judgment upon the city. If that's the case, then what we're probably experiencing here is an actual humanoid figure that is appearing in the flame or the cloud above the Ark of the Covenant. Does that make sense?
So does the cloud just stay there?
You know, it's hard to really make sense of that because there's nothing in the text that really tells us that. It seems like the glory fills the place at the time when the Lord's glory descends upon it, and he fills that in the context of Exodus 40. But we don't have any real definite speech beyond that that says the Lord's glory was always following them when they're moving in the wilderness. Because, of course, at this point, we haven't gotten there yet where they're consigned out to the wilderness. And because we don't have any other references other than what the psalmists might be saying with respect to linking this back to the historical moment when these events occurred that speak of God's glory filling that place, we can't really say for sure that the glory just simply stayed there all the time and then picked up and moved with them, or at least after they entered into the land. Like you get into the context of Joshua 18, and there they have established the tabernacle for the first time in the land of Canaan at the place of Shiloh. We have no mention of God's glory presence. We can assume that it's there, and there would be nothing wrong with assuming that, but if there was anything else in the text that would point to a contrary opinion, we would have to take that for what it is because we cannot specify that, yes, indeed, God's glory presence is still continuously filling that place. In fact, I would almost opt for the counterpoint, and that would be that there's physically nothing above the mercy seat until this particular day. And then when Aaron walks in and he has the additional things that are supposed to accompany him that we'll talk about here in a second, and then we have something like this smoke screen that stands between him and the Lord, that then the Lord appears in a perhaps humanoid appearance behind that smoke screen. So, verse 3, Aaron is to enter the most holy place in this way with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He is to wear a holy linen tunic, and linen undergarments are to be on his body. He is to tie a linen sash around him and wrap his head with a linen turban. These are holy garments, and he must bathe his body with water before he wears them. And he is to take from the Israelite community 2 male goats for a sin offering, one for a ram, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Aaron will present the bull for his sin offering and make atonement for himself and his household. Next, he will take the 2 goats and place them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. After Aaron casts lots for the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and the other for an uninhabitable place, he is to present the goat chosen by lot for the Lord and sacrifice it as a sin offering. But the goat chosen by lot for an uninhabitable place is to be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement with it by sending it out into the wilderness for an uninhabitable place. When Aaron presents the bull for his sin offering and makes atonement for himself and his household, he will slaughter the bull for his sin offering. Then he is to take a fire pan full of blazing coals from the altar before the Lord and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and bring them inside the curtain. He is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, so that the cloud of incense covers the mercy seat that is over the testimony, or else he will die. He is to take some of the bull's blood, sprinkle it with his finger against the east side of the mercy seat. So that, of course, would be the front that's facing him, because the opening to the tabernacle was always facing easterly, and the way everything is set up, the way that innermost curtain that divides holy from most holy place is oriented, that too would be facing east. So it's that part that he would have facing him as soon as he walks in. He is to take some of the bull's blood, sprinkle it with his finger against the east side of the mercy seat. Then he will sprinkle some of the blood with his finger before the mercy seat 7 times. When he slaughters the male goat for the people's sin offering and brings the blood inside the curtain, he will do the same with its blood as he did with the bull's blood. And he is to sprinkle it against the mercy seat and in front of it. He will make atonement for the most holy place in this way for all their sins because of the Israelites' impurities and rebellious acts. He will do the same for the tent of meeting that remains amongst them, because he is surrounded by their impurities. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the most holy place until he leaves, after he has made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole assembly of Israel. Then he will go to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it. He is to take some of the bull's blood, some of the goat's blood, put it on the horns on all sides of the altar. He is to sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times to cleanse and set it apart for the Israelites' impurities. When he has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he is to present the live male goat. Aaron will lay both his hands on the head of the live goat, confess over it all the Israelites' iniquities and rebellious acts, all their sins. He is to put them on the goat's head and send it away into the wilderness by the man appointed for the task. The goat will carry all their iniquities into a desolate land, and the man will release it there. So let's just break this down for what it is as we consider the various pieces that are operative. The far left side of the screen, offerings for the high priest. A bull as a kata, and as we remember from previous weeks, a kata is a sin offering, but it has the dual purpose of also being a purification offering. A ram as an olah, or a burnt offering, and of course he is to wear only holy or simple linen garments. Why do you think that is? He has special garments he is supposed to wear that only he gets to wear, and of course they are the most beautiful of all the priestly garments. On this day he is dressed in no more special attire than just what every priest gets to wear. He's supposed to be dazzling when he is inside the holy space, and the light of the lamps bouncing off all the gold that overlays the walls and the gold interwoven into the fabric of his own garments. But now all that's been laid aside. Why is that?
The gold reflects God's glory. He's not before God.
Okay, so he's not before God. Another way of looking at this could also be considering the fact that he is having to make atonement for himself, and that he's making atonement for the community, and everything is being basically set back to its original settings. In a very simplistic and almost rudimentary way, when your computer is giving you problems and it has a tendency to freeze up when you're trying to execute or run a particular program, if you have this level of computer skill, and certainly if you don't, you can take it to someone who does, oftentimes they're going to attempt to do what? If they can't debug the programming and fix all the little glitchy spots, what most likely are they going to attempt to try to do? Take it back to, wipe it clean and take it back to factory settings, the way that you got this thing the day that you bought it. It completely wipes it clean of all the programs that you've installed on it, and sad as that is, and no doubt some work that you'll have to do afterwards to put back on it the operation programs that you added to it. At the same time, though, it's supposed to completely wipe out everything that was not originally there. So that takes with it all the glitchiness and everything that's causing it to hang up and freeze whenever it's attempting to try to run a program. That's the idea here, is that everything is going back to its original settings. The way that we find it in the context of Leviticus chapter 8 and 9. And if you think about that, let me pull up this additional slide for you here. Notice what Aaron is supposed to offer for himself: a bull and a ram. In the context of Leviticus chapter 8, what was it that he was supposed to bring? Now remember, he has animals that are slaughtered. The blood that is extracted from these animals is manipulated and placed in various spots on holy instruments, and of course himself, earlobe, thumb, great toe. all on the same side of the body. The particular offerings that are to be offered for himself are a bull for a kata offering and 2 rams, of course, one for an olah offering and one for the consecration offering. So with that in mind, let's move forward with what we were looking at here on this slide, because now he is also going to offer up the required offerings for the community, which are going to be 2 goats for a kata offering. But just as a side note, one of these obviously is going to be let loose out into the wilderness. At this point, the reason why they're both called kata offerings, or they're both eligible to be sin offerings, though one will not be sacrificed and therefore will not be a sin offering, is because he has no idea which one that's going to be. The lots have to be cast. Presumably, the Lord is going to choose the one he wants sent out live into the wilderness. The one whose blood is shed will be shed the exact way it's supposed to be in Leviticus 4 as a kata offering, but also a ram for an olah offering. So the reason why I have the arrows adjoining the 2 together is if you go back to this particular slide, the installation offerings for Aaron's consecration, that is the initial startup point for the tabernacle. To make this clear, Exodus 40, tabernacle, can't go in. God's glory fills the space. Leviticus 8, we have the proper offerings being given. Aaron's been properly consecrated. Now they get to go in. We just explored on the slide I popped up a second ago what was required for them to be able to go in as Aaron gets consecrated with the bull and the 2 rams. On the Day of Atonement, considering all the offerings that are brought together and combined for both Aaron and the people, because this is the Ohel Moed for which God is going to meet corporately with his people in this cultic fashion, we have the exact same setup. A bull provided by Aaron and a ram, and 1 more additional ram provided for the people. That makes the consecration installation offerings that were required to install Aaron as the new cosmic Adam, the new consecrated Adam figure that's going to get to represent them in this holy space. Does that make sense? And basically what I'm saying is on the Day of Atonement, we are taking Aaron back to the reset point, because the entire community, from Aaron all the way down to the newest members added to it through birth, are now considered part of what's going to be affected by that. Not just the people, in fact, not even primarily the people. The people are more or less the secondary intention. The primary intention is this space. All right. Now let's continue on with what's supposed to be offered for them. 2 goats for a kata, and of course, 1 is going to be slaughtered, 1 will not. So what the priest does with them, he will slaughter the kata offering for himself. Let's not think of this in the perspective of using the English term sin offering, though that's what we read in the text, that he is offering for his own sins, no matter what they might be. I say that, let me ask you a few questions first, elicit some answers from you, and then see if perhaps you might be thinking along the same wavelength that I might be. If the high priest was guilty of blatant rebellion against the Lord by committing an act of adultery, he sleeps with a woman he's not married to, what is the prescription per the law for such an act, especially if he is caught?
Murder.
Exactly, execution. It's a capital crime. Do we find anywhere in the text of Torah, anywhere in which there is a prescribed offering that he might get to bring that will appease the Lord's wrath, expiate, that means remove his sin, and allow him to continue to not only serve in this office, but to keep his life? Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be an expression of mercy. I'm not arguing against that. But what I am saying is that of all the prescriptive offerings that are given us from Leviticus 1 with the olah offering, even though there is the mention of the atonement, possibly for sin that's going on there. But remember, when we discussed this, we were talking about the broader concept of what kafir and kafar mean with respect to the idea of covering, the concept of all of the camp being something of a sacred bubble, especially this holy sacred space that is the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, where Aaron, in this particular scenario I give you, is meant to minister on behalf of the people before the Lord and represent the people before God and God before the people. So, if in none of those offerings from Leviticus 1 through 6 do we find one that would fit the bill for what any person who is guilty of such an act can offer and expect expiation or removal of their sin before God, and now no one can touch them because they are set right with God, then we certainly can't argue that something like that might be in existence in this scenario with respect to the Day of Atonement when no other offerings are being given. Remember, from the text we are seeing it's simply a kata and an olah. That is all that is being offered by Aaron and the people. There is not a special offering or subset of offerings that are now being given for which all sins of any specified type or kind are going to be wiped away. Now, we're going to build on this as we continue to move through it. So he is offering up a purification offering for himself because remember, the idea is that all of this is supposed to go back to reset. And the reason why in this context Aaron could not go in is because he had not been properly consecrated. As we move through Leviticus 8 and 9, and Moses anoints all of the sacred objects, and then he anoints Aaron with the same oil he sprinkles over every one of those sacred pieces that are serving their cultic purpose, whether inside this tent or even on the outside, considering the bronze basin and the altar of burnt offering. He sprinkles Aaron to signify that he is a part of that mixture and that none of this is functional or even purposeful without him. So Aaron obviously has to go back to reset if everything in this space is going to be set back to its initial operational value, going with the computer term.
Is there ever an instance where we see a kata or a sin offering that mitigated like temporal punishment for a particular sin?
I would say, in my knowledge of Scripture, I do not find one. I do not find any person who winds up bringing that to the gates of the temple or to the screen that separates the surroundings of the camp from the outer courtyard of the temple itself, in which anybody would meet with a priest and say, so this is what I've done, and this is what I need to offer up so that my sin is expiated. Now, of course, we have a brilliantly shining example of David who has committed some of the most atrocious acts in his story arc by the time that we have him talking a little bit about burnt offerings and fellowship offerings and whatnot. Of course, throughout the entire spectrum of David's story arc, we have a lot of moments in which he is acting in a priestly manner and offering up offerings. I mean, when he is bringing up the ark into Jerusalem, man, every 6 paces he's slaughtering an animal. So shedding of blood for the sake of any purpose is not foreign to him. But after he has slept with Bathsheba and he's had Uriah put to death to cover up for that sin, and then Nathan confronts him over that, we have him pouring out his soul in the contents and the context of Psalm 51. But it seems like that he is catching what the writer to this conglomerate of people in the scroll or book we have that is the Hebrews, in the statement that he makes, that the shedding of the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. He is speaking about the concept of lingering sin when he is asking the Lord to cleanse him on the inside, right? I mean, David clearly understands, as we have already at this point read all the words that are to be given in the Levitical text about how blood is to be shed, from what animal and for what purpose. And can you name me one purpose outside of Aaron's ordination in which a person is sprinkled with the blood of a sacrificial animal for the sake of atoning them of their sin? There isn't one. Not a one. We only have blood being sprinkled on sacred objects, and we do have blood being applied to people when it comes to binding them covenantally to the words that God has spoken to them that they agree to. But outside of that, that's it. And so because of that, David is not asking that 1,000 bulls be offered up in his stead for the sake of what he has done, and he is emptying out the wretchedness of his soul in prayer unto God and then wanting to sacrifice all of these animals for the sake of showing just how remorseful he is. He's falling headlong on the mercy of God, asking that God would cleanse him on the inside, using priestly terms because he is saying, with hyssop, clean me on the inside, right? What context have we seen hyssop being used in? Passover. We've even seen it in the cleansing of lepers with respect to the way that all of those elements are brought together. Hyssop tied to the bundle of the living bird on the pole, dipped in the blood of the sacrificed bird, and then sprinkled upon the leper who is then to be pronounced clean. That's what David is asking for. He recognizes that the moral defunctness of his actions has certainly made him unclean in the eyes of God, and he has to be made clean. But there's no sacrificial animal to be offered up that's going to make that happen for him. And so all he can do is ask God to cleanse him of his sin. Now, that's actually going to fall into the context of some of the other things that we're going to be talking about tonight with respect to the idea of what it means to be cut off. And that's not a foreign concept. We've already seen that kind of terminology being employed in other places way back in the book of Genesis. But it's going to come out with a lot more usage here in these passages. And of course, I think it's a requirement that we try to answer that as best we can to understand what does God mean when he says this person or this group of people are supposed to be cut off from the community of the people. So anyway, he's supposed to slaughter the katah for himself, and then he will cast lots for the goat that will die or live. Then he will slaughter that animal. So before he burns anything on the altar, he has got the blood for his own offerings and the blood for the people's offerings, and he is going to bring them into the holy space. And when he does, he is going to sprinkle them in certain places exactly 7 times. That's what I mean by present the blood of his katah along with the incense. Then he will come back behind that and present the blood of the people's katah. All right? Presumably the fire pan is probably still inside the innermost sanctum, and the coals are still allowing that fragrant incense to emanate in the space and shield him from the presence of the Lord. But understand, this is only atoning for the most holy place, the Ohel Moed, at least the altar of incense. Presumably, it's difficult to make this out from the text itself. We go back to the context of Leviticus 4. When a priest offers up a burnt or a katah offering for himself, it's always to be a bull. He's done that. It has to go into the innermost, or the most, I'll get right in a second. It has to go before the most holy space, right here at the altar of incense. That has to anoint the horns of that altar, and that animal cannot be eaten. Any blood that's taken past this first curtain, that animal cannot be eaten by anyone. But now when it comes to the people, whether it's a leader or just an ordinary citizen, it has to be either a male goat, female goat. That blood that is spilled will only anoint this altar out here. It's not taken behind this first curtain, and because of that, that animal can be eaten. No animals are eaten on the Day of Atonement, but my point in saying this is he's got the blood of 2 separate species. So probably with the blood of his own katah offering, he anoints this altar, and with the blood of the people's katah offering, he anoints this one. But it is not specifically broken down in the text when it says altar and the horns that belong to it. Does that make sense? So we should probably follow the contextual guidelines of Leviticus chapter 4, which would make better sense because considering that the mercy seat has been anointed with blood, this altar, which is a conduit to God, this altar, which is a conduit to God, for priest and people, it's all been pushed back to its reset by virtue of the fact blood has been applied. Now, let me go back to the text itself, and I want to read you a verse to help make sure we understand this clearly. Let everybody's eyes go back to verse 16 of this chapter. He will make atonement for the most holy place in this way for all their sins because of the Israelites' impurities and rebellious acts. He will do the same for the tent of meeting that remains among them because it is surrounded by their impurities. The way that we often read this is the complete inversion of that he is purifying the people because of their rebellious acts, and by virtue of that, this space gets purified. That's not how it's listed. The purpose behind this is to purify this space because of it's surrounded by the impurities of the people that just continues to encroach upon this space until the real threat actually becomes a possible moment of reality in which their impurities has overtaken this space and God no longer wants to remain amongst these people. He no longer wants to dwell with them. He no longer wants to meet with them. He no longer wants to walk around amongst them. What do you find happening in the opening chapters to the book of 1 Samuel? You have the worst example of an Aaronite priest, Eli, with his two sons who are about as egregious as it can get with respect to the way that they execute their office. They are gluttonous. I was gorging themselves is what I was looking for on all the meat that they choose from the offerings that the people are bringing. They are sleeping with Levite women who are not their wives, and even if they weren't married, it still wouldn't be acceptable. They're doing everything that God finds absolutely detestable outside of offering up children for burnt offerings or to Molech or whatever the case might be, or other sexually devious things. But they are certainly profaning this sacred space by what they are doing. God sends a prophet, pronounces judgment, and he says he is going to end their house, that none of them will continue to serve as priests. And then Eli dies at the moment that the ark has been taken out of this holy sacred space to be used as really nothing more than a talisman on the battlefield, and God allows it to be captured. And the ark itself, the next time it actually ends up in any structure similar to this is when? After David's dead and his son has built a house that resembles the architectural dimensions of this, and it's put back in its rightful place, but it never goes back to the tabernacle again. So does God then presumably continue to meet with his people in the Ohel Moed after it's taken out of there under the tenureship of Eli and his sons as priests? No. That's a perfectly prime and good example of what can happen when the people's impurities, not only from unintentional sin, but intentional sin, wind up overtaking this sacred space, and then God brings judgment upon it and decides he doesn't want to live there or dwell with them or meet with them there any longer. And there was nothing that could be done to basically bring that spot back to its reset value, considering what they've done. And the tabernacle really never gets used for that purpose again. How can you have a Day of Atonement when you don't have a mercy seat to sprinkle anything on? You can't. Decades go by, right? Until it's finally installed in its proper setting in the new temple that supersedes that space. So if we are understanding the context of the Day of Atonement appropriately, it's not for the sake of everybody in this land who has done anything rebellious against the Lord, which includes murder that nobody was able to detect, adultery that nobody got called out on, or whatever else, that once the Day of Atonement comes, the whole community is set back to reset. Your sins are forgiven, washed away, and if you were to die the next day, that sin has been expiated and removed from God's presence such that he doesn't remember that anymore. If you think that, then I would press you, show me where in the text that you would find anything that would suggest that. The purpose of this day is not to expiate anyone and everyone's sins. Now, of course, with that might suggest a problem. Well, what does that mean then with respect to what Jesus has done and the idea of how he fulfills this typological pattern of the Day of Atonement? Again, the writer of Hebrews and the way that he is speaking about not only the efficacy, but the outright superiority of Jesus' sacrifice, and he's doing it against the backdrop of the Day of Atonement, is speaking about how this pattern in and of itself was never meant for that purpose. Blood of bulls, goats, does not take away sin. But the Paschal Lamb, who was sacrificed on our part, and who entered into the actual holy space by which this was patterned after, offering himself up once for all, is able to completely purge our conscience. I'm not even calling into question whether or not substitutionary atonement is a legit thing in the Old Testament. It absolutely is. None of this makes sense apart from the context of a substitute being offered in our place. But one thing that's different here is this is a theocratic setting. The idea is that every one of these Israelite citizens are God's subjects, and he is the one who delineates what is allowable as goes what can be expiated, unintentional sin, something done unwittingly, or a blatant act of rebellion can be met straight up with capital punishment, which is the taking of that person's life and there being no chance for atonement. And circumstances can be bad enough that God decides, I've had it with this space, and removes himself from that context. More can be said. I could let this dominate the whole lesson, but I'm not going to.
So let me ask this question.
Yeah, sure, go for it, man.
So, I mean, this pretty much shuts down any idea of dispensationalism and like modern theology. What did the Israelites think about the, I guess you could say, I don't like using dispensation, but it feels like it fits, the dispensation of God's grace to salvation to them individually, then, you understand the question?
Yes, absolutely. And I would have to say, the way I would meet that is I'm not exactly sure that we can put ourselves in a position where we can say this is exactly how they would have understood it, the way that we understand what we have salvifically, as goes our individual redemption in Christ. Because they understand with the honor-shame society that they live in, everybody is full-on responsible for their own actions, which brings condemnation upon the community. I mean, it's not going to be too long after this. We're going to get into the context of other stories where Achan brings shame upon himself and his whole family has to bear the consequences of what it was he did. And, you know, there are side arguments as goes whether or not they could have been accomplices. Did they know? Did they help him in hiding that fact? Whatever the case might be. But it's a crystal clear example to the community of the fact that consequences indeed get passed down to more than just the person who was involved in certain contexts. Even with respect to what David did with Bathsheba. I mean, David, he kept his hair unkept. He didn't groom himself properly, as goes his entire body. Really didn't do much as goes ruling the kingdom, while the son that was born through Bathsheba was lying there sick, dying, and ailing. And he was hoping that maybe if God chose to be gracious, that he might spare the child and let him live. But God had already pronounced through Nathan that he was going to die, and God did not relent. So by that point, I would say that certainly if the events of Psalm 51 and 32 have happened, and David had pled for forgiveness, and he felt like he had been reconciled to God, believed that in faith for what it was, that in throwing himself upon God's mercy, that God had indeed chose to forgive him and was allowing him to continue to stay alive, remain king over his people, did not take his spirit away from him, yet he allows the consequence to play out. The child dies. So having said that, I don't think that we can actually look at it from the perspective of everybody understands individualized salvation in this context like we do when we come and express faith in Christ, embracing him as Messiah, understanding that his blood can fully atone for our sin and forgive us. Because there's nothing like that in that context that's even being offered to them. You as the community, because it's always put down like that, you as a people must obey, must listen, must choose to follow, walk in the wisdom and light of my counsel. If not, then there are individualized punishments for moments of rebellion, such as adultery, bestiality, whatever the case might be. But corporately speaking, it's all about if you don't, then all of you will not get to experience my blessings and will get to experience the curses that come from this. So I hope in some way that that kind of answers that. I don't think that they could have understood it the way that we do on this side of the cross. And maybe a part of that too is because of the fact that we're so used to individualizing these experiences that we have to retrain our brains to even think about this corporate concept that to us is a bit more foreign, the way that we talk about salvation in our own communal setting.
There was nothing in the Old Testament though that would be similar to a New Testament salvation. Because I mean, there's other than outside of obedience and trusting in the promises of God in the Old Testament, there's nothing else. I mean, sacrificial system didn't bring salvation. I mean, is there another device in the Old Testament that brought a New Testament salvation?
No, not in the way that we would think of. I mean, because again, all of these things are but glimpses. They're shadows of what the actual form will be. But it's easy to see how so much of that is still shrouded in ambiguity at this point in the development of the text. All we have is basically a reestablishing of a previous pattern. The ideal of Genesis 1 through 2, garden space that man has been kicked out of because of his sin in chapter 3, and now them being restored and brought into that, and they all corporately are a new Adam. Yeah, Aaron is also the actual figure that represents them, but the way that God applies certain things to them, speaking about how not only is the newly consecrated Adam figure, Aaron, holy, but he also, in these very chapters we'll speak of tonight, telling the people, I am the Lord your God, and because of that, and by virtue of the fact I am holy, you too are to be holy. So in some limited context, he's also applying that aspect of a newly consecrated Adam figure to the whole entire nation itself. So again, they should be thinking more in a corporate concept, and I would argue that we should too, even from a New Testament perspective. Before we even drill it down to the eaches of my own individualized salvation, Jesus is not speaking about that in many of the contexts of the gospel narrative. He is speaking about a whole flock. He is speaking about his people. And many of the apostles are writing after that to the conglomerates of different congregations out there and speaking very broadly to them rather than individually to one particular person. We see that from the individualized perspective because it's our own unique experience. But we need to forego that for the sake of seeing how this works corporately with the whole meta-narrative of Scripture. In other words, person that's supposed to represent a people that will come from him, now we have people. And this concept is what's also carried over into the New Testament because Israel is continued in the church. The church does not replace Israel. Israel is not a separate and distinct entity. It continues to grow in and with the church using the same operative name, if that makes sense. And so with that in mind, we're still talking about a new covenant people of God and all the implications that go with that, as goes how this story has developed here to tell us more about how that story will develop once the new covenant comes. It's not a problem that we see it from the individualized perspective. Because we do that at the expense of the corporate perspective, we cut all the other corporate implications out of it, and we're only thinking about what does this mean for me? And that's the inappropriate way to see it.
I think that's what leads to it, don't judge me. Warren does something, or I'm doing something, and Warren shouldn't call me out on it, and which hurts the whole entire body because we're not doing church discipline and all those types of things.
Yes, I would have to agree. Does that make sense? Makes sense? Did I kind of answer your question?
I was kind of thinking, whenever you mentioned it, I was kind of thinking about reading it through the prophets.
Okay.
Like maybe, Ezekiel in
Yeah.
chapter 21 talks about the, sword of judgment to come. Prophetically speaking, I think there's some significance if the layperson looked at the prophets to say, okay, salvifically, we are speaking on an individual level, but they would really, really, really have to read into it. A lot of people just say prophecy is best looked at in hindsight.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm with you. I don't think that we have an understanding of their understanding of how individualism worked inside the congregation.
And it's a different way of thinking about it because it's an entirely different cultural context. Right. And that's why it's important for us to make sure that we're trying to get back to that so that we can make sense of how the rest of the story goes, because Jesus is a Jew growing up in that communal context and seeing these stories in the same way that they did. So to understand how he talks about it, we have to see that for what it is, or we're just making assumptions about these stories based on the face value of his words that could be outright inappropriate. And that wouldn't be good either. Correct?
But are they continuing to see this seed from this woman from Genesis 3:15, the promise given? Are they, this whole narrative of the Old Covenant, are they looking toward that person? Are they, with each prophet, king, whatever it may be, are they thinking that? Do they have that mindset of a fulfillment of the promise of Genesis 3:15? Is that going on now and continues to go on all the way to Christ?
I would say at this moment in the story, no. I would say that we don't have any real evidence that would point us to that because we're so young with respect to the development of the narrative itself here in Leviticus. Even though thousands of years of human history have passed, yet still it's pretty recent on the stage, as goes Abraham, and then of course very little growth with respect to the community, which there is none until we have an explosion of multiplication in Egypt. But they're under duress there once they start to multiply, right? And so I don't think it's until you get to the period of the prophets, as he's talking about, who are then reflecting back on these stories, riffing off some of these early developments in the words of Moses and calling these things back out for what they are to show them this is how we went wrong. And this is where we're failing here, because this is what God intended to do all along, and how we are blatantly rebelling against him by virtue of what he has commissioned us for. So I could say in Leviticus, no. I would say by the time of Isaiah, probably certainly much more of a development of that concept, especially as we're starting to talk about a more prolific figure like a new David coming on the scene, and then tying him in to other figures like a Moses or whatever the case might be for how he's going to function for the community at large. Make sense? Kind of. All right, so let's jump over to chapter 17. We're going to read some stuff. I broke this down like I did this slide here from last week, if you remember that. So we're going to go each of these panels one at a time, okay? So don't get overwhelmed by that. But let's start with chapter 17. I'm going to read the first 16 verses. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and all the Israelites and tell them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Anyone from the house of Israel who slaughters an ox, sheep, or goat in the camp, or slaughters it outside the camp, instead of bringing it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before his tabernacle, that person will be considered guilty. He has shed blood and is to be cut off from his people. This is so the Israelites will bring to the Lord the sacrifices they have been offering in the open country." So notice this is a pattern that's been going on now. Even though they are still fresh out of Egypt, a little more than a year removed from that. But apparently, while they have been camped around Sinai, this practice has still continued. They are to bring them to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting and offer them as fellowship sacrifices to the Lord. The priest will then splatter the blood on the Lord's altar at the entrance to the tent of meeting and burn the fat as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. They must no longer offer their sacrifices to the goat demons they have prostituted themselves with. I realize goat demons might not be what you have operatively in your translation if you're reading something other than either the HCSB or CSB. But nonetheless, from the actual Hebrew rendering of what amounts to the word satyr, that's what it truly means, hairy, and it's speaking of some sort of demonic entity. Anyway, verse 8, "Say to them, anyone from the house of Israel or from the aliens who reside among you, or among them who offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice but does not bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to the Lord, that person is to be cut off from his people. Anyone from the house of Israel or from the aliens who reside among them who eats any blood, I will turn against that person who eats blood and cut him off from his people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have appointed it to make atonement for you on the altar, since it is the lifeblood that makes atonement. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you and no alien who resides amongst you may eat blood. Any Israelite or alien residing amongst you who hunts down a wild animal or bird that may be clean must drain its blood and cover it with dirt, since the life of every creature is in its blood. I have told the Israelites, you are not to eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is in its blood. Whoever eats it must be cut off. Every person, whether the native or the resident alien, who eats any animal that died a natural death or has been mauled by a wild beast is to wash his clothes, bathe his body with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Then he will be clean. But if he does not wash his clothes and bathe himself, he will bear his own iniquity." So if oxen and herd animals are sacrificed, that's the operative idea. Now, that is not said here in this context. It said if their blood is shed. But we have to take that into consideration, going all the way to the far right of the screen, with what is said later, almost 40 years, with Moses' future words in Deuteronomy 12, 15 through 19. This is what Moses says there. "But whenever you want, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your city gates, according to the blessing the Lord your God has given you. Those who are clean or unclean may eat it, as they would a gazelle or deer. But you must not eat the blood. Pour it on the ground like water. Within your city gates you may not eat the tenth of your grain, new wine, or fresh oil, the firstborn of your flock or herd, any of your vow offerings that you pledge, your freewill offerings, or your personal contributions. You are to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God at the place the Lord your God chooses. You, your son, your daughter, your male and female slave, and the Levite who is within your city gates. Rejoice before the Lord your God in everything you do, and be careful not to neglect the Levite as long as you live in your land." So these very same animals can be killed inside your own city. If you choose to have a barbecue and you want to invite your family members to come along, that's fine. However, if you intend in some way to shed the blood of this animal in a ritualistic, cultic, expressive way, it has to be offered as a shalem. a peace or fellowship offering. Now, operatively in the construct of Deuteronomy 12, with the idea of, like I said, a barbecue, invite your son, your daughter, your manservant, female servant, especially the Levites that live in your cities, and he mentions them again at the end of that passage. Do not neglect the Levite. Make sure they get brought in too, to your little communal barbecue there. That's fine. But that's only if you're wanting to kill the animal for the sake of eating the meat. If you want to burn this in a sacred way, because there's a prescriptive manner that comes with that, as goes positioning of certain things that are taken out, fat and whatever the case might be, then that has to go to the tabernacle setting and offered up as a shalem. And this would obviously only be done for the purpose, this would be done if they are not being used for the purpose of other sacrifices. So why a shalem offering? What is the process meant to invoke? Remember, I know it's been a while. Fellowship, okay, but fellowship with who? God. Yes, that's the exact concept we're looking for. Is if it's offered in a ritualistic fashion, then the meal, the communal barbecue, is just simply moved over to the tabernacle. God is invited along with that, and so are some of the Levites and priests who are working there in that space. Now, it's hard for us to imagine a context or a scenario in which one might offer it a little differently than what they would do if they were just going to simply slaughter the animal in their own dwelling, in their own city or village. That's not something I think that we can get a good, clear answer from the biblical text on, but they would know in their own setting and time how they're going to offer this and what they intend to do with it. But understand, this is not one of those contexts in which if they slaughter the animal in a ritualistic way, that's supposed to be offered in the tabernacle system or construct, but they fail to do that, that this is considered then an unintentional sin, and the context of Leviticus 4 could be enacted, an unintentional sin. Let me purify myself by virtue of that. You know how you're going to offer it. You know what your intent behind offering it is. And if you slaughter it that way without taking it to the right place to do it in, then you are to be cut off. Now that's rather drastic. All right, we'll talk about that here in a second. Consider what's said after this. If it's not offered in this way, the offerer will be guilty of blood guilt. That word, dom, the way you would pronounce dawn, is just an M on the end of it. Dom, the way this is used in many other contexts, outright reflects homicide. This very word makes its opening debut in Scripture in the context of Genesis 4 when Cain kills Abel, and his blood, dom, cries out from the ground unto the Lord. What is it that Cain did to Abel? He killed him, right? So the offerer would be seen as being guilty of shedding blood. Now, we don't have this within the context of what we've read. We'll have to cheat from future passages. But what we are clearly told in the book of Numbers, expressly the conduit of chapters 33 through 35, you murder somebody in the country, what has to happen? If a person is guilty of premeditated murder, what has to happen to that person? They get executed. Problem is, though, is that the land gets defiled from that. Now, it's expressly stated in that context that nothing can be done to remove the defilement from the land. All right? So a person who is guilty of blood guilt, and this is the point I make in referencing it back to this is the reason why, is because the inappropriate shedding of blood, and in this context, that's exactly what this is. It's an inappropriate shedding of blood, brings blood guilt upon the person and communally the land. So this becomes an egregious sin against the Lord and the people. All right? Moving on, the offender must be cut off from the community. That Hebrew word for cut off is karat. It's a punishment that can either mean exile or death, because in many contexts, it's either or. Case in point, in the flood story, that's what God did to all flesh. He karat all flesh by sending the waters that came with the flood and sent them all off into the exile of death. And of course, karat is the male who is not circumcised on the 8th day. However, this is another context, though, opposite of the previous, in which we're not saying that males, for whatever reason, are not circumcised 8 days after birth, then have to be thrown into a pile and just die there. That just simply means they are not allowed to be a part of the community of the people. They are henceforth forevermore exiled. And to be placed in a position like this is basically turning them over to God. Any context in which a person is karat, but they are not expressly condemned to death, that is turning them over to the realm of God outside of the camp as far away from God's presence on this sacred mountain construct we have, in which now they belong to Him and He can choose to do what He wants. He can spare their lives and allow them to continue to live, or He can put them to death Himself, but the people are not then obliged to bring justice upon them because God has not expressly demanded that they die, unless perhaps we're talking about a situation in which they are brought before the Lord. The Urim and the Thummim are engaged, and the Lord then divulges through that exactly what His express intent is. Does that make sense? All right, sacrifices to goat demons for apotropaic purposes are forbidden. That big word, apotropaic, it just simply means to ward off, like wearing a talisman, a special jewel or object that's supposed to ward off demons. That's kind of the idea here, is that most scholars seem to think that's probably what's going on here, and that may very well have been a practice that they picked up from Egypt. Who knows how far back this winds up going. But the idea is that they're offering up outside of sacred space, and sacred space is quite new to them, considering the development of the narrative itself and how this whole concept of sacred space inside the tabernacle works. But they have been offering sacrifices to the Lord, burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, on earthen altars before the tabernacle becomes fully operational. Not in the tent of meeting that Moses meets on. God told them in the context of Exodus 19 and 20, if you make an altar for me, do not chisel it out of stones. It has to be an earthen altar. There you will offer your burnt offering and your fellowship offerings. Are they supposed to continue to do that after they have the tabernacle? Presumably not. God wants worship centralized in this one location. This really seems to be driving that context home all the more. Having said that, though, they probably were offering other offerings to these goat demons or whatever these spiritual entities are for the sake of attempting to try to ward off things that you don't want negatively influencing the community. Give me a few examples of things you think they might be trying to chase away.
Disease.
Especially when it comes to the concept of infant mortality. All these things. They're not in a position yet to start growing crops, but we don't want animals succumbing to disease and all these kinds of things. And certainly we have no idea what kind of superstitious tales that existed amongst them, as goes the boogeyman that exists out there in the dark who comes and steals babies out from the tent in the middle of the night and sucks their blood or does whatever, right? Who knows what kind of stories they were passing around. And again, the idea of shedding blood, offering up something to keep those things away and to ward off bad stuff. God wants those practices immediately and forever suspended. And all of this, of course, applies both to the resident aliens and the native citizens of the land. So why do you think that this rule would apply to resident aliens as much as it would the citizens of Israel as well? Sacred space, absolutely. And it will help keep idolatry out of the land, which will serve to further defile the land, because idolatry comes in many forms in cultic expression itself. Sexual intercourse and various other things are involved in these kinds of things. Bart was making a good example of that on Sunday when he was talking about the Asherah rites and the idea that wherever these poles and sacred sites, usually on hills or elevated platforms and whatnot, definitely mountains, could be found all throughout the land of Canaan. Those were cultic prostitute sites as well, so certainly. I just went ahead and gave this to you. Blood is not to be consumed, drained. Why does blood have to be covered when you're hunting and you skin the animal and you want to harvest the meat from it? Why are you supposed to kick dirt over the blood? There it is. Blood is not to be considered profane or common. It's a life-giving fluid. If it's supposed to be treated with sacredness because it is given on the altar in order to make atonement, and it is only to be used for that context in sacred space, the things that belong in sacred space are holy, and they are to be treated with great reverence and respect. After all, there's a separate and distinct sacrifice to be made, the guilt offering, Leviticus 6, if you offend any one of the Lord's holy objects. Right? We gave the example of what happens when a Levite's wife accidentally puts one of the sacred spoons in her cloak or whatever the case might be. Then it has to be restored and blood has to be shed in order to make that operatively clean again. All right? So, any questions on this context and what these words mean? Let's move on. Forbidden pagan practices. Let's look at Leviticus 18, the first 6 verses, and then we'll jump to 19. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites, tell them, I am the Lord your God. Do not follow the practices of the land of Egypt where you used to live, or the practices of the land of Canaan where I'm bringing you to. You must not follow their customs. You are to practice my ordinances. You are to keep my statutes by following them. I am the Lord your God. Keep my statutes and ordinances. A person will live if he does them. I am the Lord. You are not to come near any close relative for sexual intercourse. I am the Lord. A lot of examples given there as to what that means. So we're going to skip down to verse 19. You are not to approach a woman during her menstrual impurity to have sexual intercourse with her. You are not to have sexual intercourse with your neighbor's wife, defiling yourself with her. You are not to sacrifice any of your children in the fire to Molech. Do not profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. You are not to sleep with a man as with a woman. It is detestable. You are not to have sexual intercourse with any animal, defiling yourself with it. The woman is not to present herself to an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion. Do not defile yourselves by any of these practices, for the nations I am driving out before you defiled themselves by all these things. If there was ever a question in anyone's mind as to why exactly the Lord is doing what he is with Israel to the Canaanite tribes when he declares holy war on them and devotes all of them over to the ban, haram, complete total destruction, this is why. He is outlining in a very clear way the things that he has found to be most egregious in his sight. And we can imagine, I mean, these even in our own day are still some of the most depraved things a person can do. And so verse 25, the land has become defiled, so I am punishing it for its iniquity, and the land will vomit out its inhabitants. Notice that. A couple of times in what we've just read, do not defile yourself by doing this. Do not defile yourself by doing that. And he said, by virtue of these practices, the land too, it's a total package. People, land going together, the land too has become defiled. Is God offering them a system of atonement to cleanse the land? I don't mean Israel. I mean the Canaanite tribes. Has he come to them and give them a means by which to cleanse the land from their impurities, but they just decided, you know what, I'm good, I'm not really going to do that. It's no hard feelings, God. Of course not. That's important because God will use this as a reference point later on when he speaks through Moses and reveals future legislation when he says, if you do the things that these people did, guess what I'm going to do to you? Exactly what I'm doing to them. If he is saying these practices have defiled the land, this is the reason why the land is vomiting them out. Do you think then that even though he has given them, Israel, a system of atonement, even the Day of Atonement, that is to completely purify and put sacred space back to its reset point, removing the defilement of impurity that has encroached upon sacred space where he dwells, do you think that God has given them a system of atonement that is going to completely cleanse the land from these kinds of impure practices, these kinds of moral evils? No. And if there is no system of atonement for the land to cleanse it all, then what is God obligated to do then? Exactly what he did to these people. All right? He says in verse 26, you are to keep my statutes and ordinances. You must not commit any of these detestable acts, not the native or the alien that resides amongst you. For the people who were in the land prior to you have committed all these detestable acts. The land has become defiled. If you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Any person who does any of these detestable acts is to be cut off from his people. You must keep my instruction to not do any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you, so that you do not defile yourselves by them. I am the Lord your God. Let's just go back here for a quick second, because on this slide here, I have color-coded these the way that I have, because I want you to see that this over here, this column with the orange box that serves as its heading, is really the midpoint of chapter 18, which is forbidden pagan practices. And I didn't forget to change the title of the other one over there. It's the exact same thing. Because in chapter 20, you're going to see almost every single one of these customs repeated yet again. Now, we have something of a communal application here, as goes what's over here in chapter 18, what we just read here. And with that, God's saying that these people are to be cut off. But in more specific contexts over there in chapter 20, God is assigning the death penalty to many of these particular things. We'll see how that plays out here in a second. But these kind of wrap around the context of what's there. Be holy because I am holy, the context of chapter 19. So they're looking forward to that, and coming off the heels of that, they are working in tandem with each other and using those words in chapter 19, which we'll explore here in just a second, as the central hinge that they kind of swing around. All right? Anyway, let's get back to this. So, do not follow any of the practices of the land of Egypt or Canaan. These practices defile both them and the land. So So why does it matter if the land has been defiled as opposed to just the person? It's what we just talked about there a second ago, right? So can the land be atoned for, considering Yahweh's warning the land would vomit them out? Hopefully at this point you understand the answer is no. The land cannot be atoned for. Hence the reason why he is threatening them right now, so they understand up front, it will vomit you out. No practicing of incest with any family member. However, it's important for us to understand what that means. The Hebrew word here is she'ar, with respect to relatives that are in focus, and all the other verses that come after this to drill this home. There are 6 total relationships that are counted in this, and that is either parents, siblings, or children. Cannot have intercourse with any of them. For the most part, other family members are considered to be affinity relatives, but they do exist in their own separate zone, because this has to make exception for the possibility of a levirate marriage. If my brother dies, he has no children, I'm obligated, even if I'm married, to take his wife and have children through her to raise up in his stead, and everything that he would have bequeathed to his own children, if he did have some, would be given over to that firstborn son, who is now basically head of his estate and holdings. Make sense? So if she was considered she'ar, I could not do that. That's incestuous. That has to be dealt with appropriately. By this affinity relationship, on the other hand, she can be brought into my bedchamber, and then I can do what is required of me in order to honor my dead brother because of the communal obligation. All right? That's important for us to make sense of. Then notice how express condemnation is given of marrying sisters. It doesn't call out Jacob for what he did, but we know that's not what he did by choice, but nonetheless, all the consequences that came from that. No having intercourse with a woman who was menstruating. Why? Remember what we talked about last week in the context of chapters 11 through 15? If a woman has vaginal bleeding of any kind going on, it's the idea of this process mimicking death. A life-giving fluid is leaving the body. So by virtue of that, she is tainted by death. If that process resolves, which of course it's meant to, month to month, after that she undergoes the process of purification, then she's available for her husband again. The idea, of course, is that they will conceive children anytime they come together. During this process, this is a pre-scientific era, so certainly they had no knowledge of such a thing. We understand a bit better now, but certainly when a woman is going through said process, it is virtually impossible for her to conceive a child because she is ridding herself of the product or the preparatory products for conception by virtue of this process. So if life cannot be conceived, that's another reason why this is considered condemnatory in that process itself. That goes on to what comes after this. Not so much the committing adultery with your neighbor's wife, that makes sense, but not sacrificing children to Molech or homosexuality and bestiality being prohibited. Notice how in many of these contexts, and it's not just Israel itself, it's many other ancient Near Eastern cultures as well, a lot of them really don't reflect the idea of lesbianism being a problem. I'm not saying it isn't. We should understand that it is. But the reason why in most cases it's not even being reflected as an issue is because in a pre-scientific era, the idea is that the man is the one who puts his seed into the woman, and by virtue of that is passing on a child, not that he has a child inside him, but his seed will become a child once one is conceived inside her womb. A man can do that. A woman lying with another woman, that process in and of itself is completely impossible. The Hebrew word here for intercourse is the literal understanding of a man giving his semen to. So if a man was to give his semen to another man, a child cannot be conceived. It's impossible. This is supposed to be seen as a beautiful act of creation. But creation is not possible when a man does this with another man. The same reason why a man is not supposed to do this with an animal, because a man cannot inseminate his seed into another animal to produce human life. So by virtue of the fact that this is contrary to creation, either the child is destroyed as an offering to Molech, or it cannot be created through homosexuality, bestiality. This understanding then is to help us better see why these acts are wrong and they are perversions of nature. Any questions on that stuff?
You did good on that.
Good.
Hit everything.
I'm not going to read, we're a little less than 10 minutes left, so I'm not going to read the contents of Exodus chapter 19. A lot of this we've already seen in, Leviticus 19. We've already seen a lot of this in Exodus chapter 20. Let me just go through the green boxes. So the Decalogue, for the most part, is reiterated, at least those 5 commands, and it appears to be centered around the concept of human relationships, all right? Emphasis is added in many places on the poor being observed. especially in agrarian practices, not gleaning the corners of your field, not going over them multiple times to make sure you catch everything you drop. Leave all that stuff for the poor to come behind, especially when it comes to justice, because the poor are easily exploitable given the fact they have no money, they can't pay for good legal representation, any of those things. And of course, though they have nothing, it's easy to just cut them out of the whole picture here by taking what little bit they have, or certainly putting them in a position where now they can be seen as property even and assimilated as slaves. Honesty must prevail in everything, the justice system, marketplaces. The chapter itself ends with the idea of having just and equal weights. You do not have one set of weights for the poor or for the slightly underprivileged, so that way you can exact higher prices from them. But when your buddy comes along, you have a different set of weights that offsets where he gets to actually sell at a greater profit or anything like that. Same for everyone, because everyone in this context is considered equal. It doesn't matter who they are. No preferences for the rich over the poor. Honoring the Sabbath and reverence for the mikdash. This is a separate word, a totally separate word from what we've seen, either Mishkan or Ohel Moed, that refers to the sanctuary. And it comes from the exact same root, Kodesh, that we use to speak of something like the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh. All right? It's holy. So reverence this sanctuary space as a holy space. And of course, the occult is expressly forbidden, and we'll talk about that here in a second as to why that is. But the centrifugal thing going on here with respect to the idea of being holy, because God is holy, holy being set apart. Holy is not synonymous with righteous, two totally separate words. That's Kodesh, that's Sadiq, totally separate. The idea is set apart. The way if you take a carrot and you cut it off and you move that piece over here in its own little separate entity now. That's the basic understanding of what holy is. It's separate altogether, transcendent. How can we be holy like an infinite God is holy? Through practice. The way his heart is reflected here in every one of these social relationships at every tier in society, whether we're talking about implementing justice, the selling of goods and wares, or just in individual relationships when it comes to the idea of me not taking what belongs to you, not coveting your wife, and not lying to you. So they are, in every respect, supposed to be a completely set apart and a holy people. And you see this popping up in every single one of these words here. Offering a fellowship sacrifice to the Lord. You might think, well, how exactly does that reflect a communal concept? Better yet, why is that even here? I mean, it seems kind of a bit discordant, right? That God would say, you're to respect your father and mother, then right after that, keep my Sabbaths. What does respecting my mother and father have to do with honoring the Sabbaths? Don't turn to worthless idols or make images of other gods. Okay, he's like just shotgun blasting everything. And then moves to, if you're to offer a fellowship sacrifice, why not a burnt offering? Burnt offerings seem to be more important. Why not a sin offering? Why does he capitalize on fellowship offerings? Respecting your father and mother, a perfect training ground for how you will embrace your heavenly Father. If you cannot submit yourself to their authority, you certainly won't to your Father's authority, being your heavenly Father. Keep my Sabbaths, because Sabbath rest is the relational aspect of what God wanted with Adam. When he invited him into that initial sacred space that he had to kick the man out of, it was to bring him into that Sabbath rest where God dwells with man, man with God, and then man learns to walk with God in holiness, and of course, according to his wisdom and guidance. Making worthless idols for yourself, obviously, is to cast your allegiance to something else that isn't God, and fellowship offerings are, as Judy said earlier, it's fellowship with God. And it brings the community into it as well, because when you offer up an animal for a shalem, you have brought your family to do this. You want your family to enjoy shalem with God, as well as God's representatives, the priests and Levites who were there in sacred space, acting on the part of God, who are eating his portions for him. All right? And anyone who eats it, that means anyone who does not offer it like a fellowship offering should, or rather that they eat it after the third day, then they will bear their iniquity. He has profaned what is holy to the Lord. That person will be cut off. Many more examples here through all these passages. But I want to get down to something else that I didn't cover over there that I think kind of gets a little bit lost in translation. I'm sure we've all read this before, and we're thinking, what in the world? Why does God care if we crossbreed two different kinds of livestock? I mean, mules are okay, even in this context. So why is it that if you breed a horse and donkey to get a mule, is that okay, but yet this is not? What does he even mean by that? Now, this is the problem with us in our westernized setting. We're totally thinking about scientific premises here and the idea of, okay, well, if men and men are not supposed to do that, then certainly animals who have no business doing those things shouldn't be. That's not what this means. Maybe we're thinking about the idea of actually putting two animals yoked side by side. That's not what this means either. That's a different context mentioned in a different place for different reasons. If we're stopping and thinking about something here, let's look at the idea of the cherubim in the tabernacle. These things litter sacred space. They're everywhere. Curtains, wall reliefs, on top of the Ark of the Covenant. What are cherubim? What do they look like? Animals. You go to Ezekiel's context, and he says when he sees the faces of these creatures, what does he see? A man, an ox, an eagle, a lion. They're all mixed in one entity. Okay, so why does God get to have a representation of a mixture of creatures, but we're not supposed to? What does that even mean? Well, if you think about it, where do you see the cherubim? In the whole community, from the fringes of the camp to the sacred space, where do you see cherubim, and only do you see cherubim? In sacred space, exactly right. But they are not to be represented anywhere else. These are objects that belong exclusively in sacred space. Notice the title of the slide. This is exactly what God told Aaron the day he killed his two sons. You are to teach the people how to distinguish between holy and common, clean and unclean. What is sacred belongs in sacred space. What is not sacred does not belong in sacred space, and what is sacred does not belong in unsacred space. And mixtures like this that are okay for the heavenly realm that now mingles with the earthly realm in sacred space are fine, but not outside of those precincts. Else, you start to take a holy object and treat it as common or profane, and you lose reverence for it.
Even though those things are livestock, though, like on the cherubim, like the man, eagle, lion, are those considered livestock?
Yeah. I mean, not a lion so much, but, the ox. I mean, do we actually think that oxen are walking around up in heaven? I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying, why is it that those things are reflected in the amalgams that are the chimeric creatures of cherubim? They represent what's also here on the earthly terrain as well. But again, this is where heaven and earth meet in sacred space. You don't find those things outside of those particular areas.
I know, but you don't, you can't breed a cat and a dog.
That's true.
So why are we saying don't breed your two different types of livestock? That if they can't physically breed together, they can't breed together. So again, what would be your point of saying that? They can't do it.
I can't say that there is not the existence of some sort of ancient practice in which they are attempting to try to do that. I mean, I don't know how exactly it is that man came across the idea that horses and donkeys can do what they do to make mules. Did they intentionally do that, or was that something that these animals alone stumbled across?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, did they intentionally do it, and it was acceptable? Because, I mean, when you do that, you make that animal.
Right. And
so that cuts off life in itself.
True. And I'm not even saying this is what is reflecting that. I think, if anything, it's the idea of maybe not just simply the idea of them doing that out in nature with respect to live animals, but maybe even in their own artistry. I mean, there are rabbinic passages that go beyond the idea of just the physical practice of making animals attempt to try to copulate each other.
That's what Egypt did with their gods,
Mm-hmm.
were part animal, part human.
Right. And then moving on that same beat of thought, do not put on a garment made of two kinds of material. Something that Christians have been getting laughed at for centuries. Why does that matter? And of course, something we almost always violate on a daily basis, wearing synthetic fabrics that are made of multiple things, right? But what does this mean? Does it really mean that it's a total sin for you to wear a garment that's made of both linen and wool? Better yet, we have complete violations of this very standard by some of the most holy members of this community. The high priest, his garments, they are made of an amalgam of both wool and linen. He has a mixture of fabrics in his own garment. Why is it okay for the high priest to have that, but everyone else not to? Oh, but wait. They haven't gotten there yet, but in the book of Numbers, they will. Once they violate the Lord's commands again, and he punishes them severely, and then he tells them, from this moment on, everybody is to have tassels on the corners of their garment. That single blue thread that ran through the knot chain that now become adorning the edges of their garments was a single woolen thread implanted in a sea of linen cords, all tied together in a variation of knots. They have mixed their fabrics together. Why is that okay? Where do we see this kind of thing going on too? Operatively, in the actual tabernacle itself. When you consider the curtains that hang above the high priest's head when he's in the holy place and he's looking up there at what are these cherubim seemingly flying above his head that form the ceiling of the tabernacle itself, those are multiple different threads of fabrics all mixed together. But what is the common denominator in that aspect? The high priest and the curtains in the tabernacle. Where are we talking about? Sacred space. But you in the community, on the other hand, hence the reason why I have the blue box, life outside of sacred space, are not to take those holy things and principles and bring them outside of sacred space and make them common or profane and operative in your daily sector in what you do, wherever you do it at, outside of this space. That more or less seems to be the thing that's going on here. And with the idea of that, the same thing with sowing your field with different types of seed. Not because of the experiment that Judy and I just happened to stumble into when we happened to plant cucumbers and squash too close to each other and they cross-pollinated and made something that was totally nasty. But just the simple fact that where do you even get stuff to make linen thread from? Linen comes from flax seeds. You guys are enjoying that. Just a bit too much. It was so gross. Not because we wanted to, it just happened. But linen comes from flax. Flax is grown in the garden. If you grow linen beside or flax beside something else, that now is going to wind up, I'm not saying they used cotton fabrics, but of course that is something that would be easily understandable to us. Growing flax that becomes linen that most people will use in their regular ordinary garments, but other things that might not supposed to be used in regular, average, common, profane settings, but more for sacred settings, you don't want the seeds that are going to be used to make these materials growing beside each other in the same gardens. Why? Because it's the idea of taking what is sacred and making it profane, holy and making it profane. They are to be taught the difference between the two, to respect what is holy, reverence what is holy, and treat what is common as such. Does that make sense? All right. I know that's a lot on the slide, but it's really just a few things. Let me comment on this real quick and then we'll be done. All right? So again, concept of not sacrificing children to Molech or the occult itself being expressly forbidden. Why is that? Because in the occult setting, what are you attempting to try to do? When a person goes and visits spiritists or mediums, they are attempting to try to gain access to divine knowledge. Who is the one who has access to divine knowledge? Well, God, and He, of course, has this spread out amongst His divine counsel. Prophets are going to be invited into the divine counsel to hear God's plans, His intentions, His agenda, and then to pass these things on to His people when they are given allowance to utter these things. The high priest in this sacred pouch that exists behind the breastplate, Urim, Thummim, when they want to divine God's will, that's what they do. They come, they ask, they inquire. These rocks, die, whatever they are, cast as they will totally delineate what it is that God wants done in this particular circumstance with a pretty much closed-in yes or no answer. But for a person to try to circumvent that process and go to somebody else to try to get into those precincts to gain access to divine knowledge will almost always come at a premium. The shedding of blood, sacrifices, which of course promotes what? Idolatry. Prostituting yourself away from God by attempting to try to learn something that you are not supposed to know. Of course, simple things that to them would amount to so much more. The idea of whether or not a pregnancy is going to be successful, we're going to have good crops, animals going to give birth, any of that stuff. The investments that I made, are they going to pan out? Am I going to become rich? All this stuff without having to go to God and ask such things. And then, of course, committing adultery with your neighbor's wife, practicing incest. The idea here is that these are all acts of anti-creation. Think about the Genesis 1 through 2 prologue. The idea that God is the one who ordains and establishes the family unit. If you prostitute yourself with another person who you are not married to, you're making yourself one flesh with another person. You can't do that. You can't be one flesh with multiple people. You're meant to be one flesh with one person. So this is seen as an act of anti-creation. And if we go back to the idea of what is going on in the Genesis 1 through 3 prologue, it's God taking primordial water and ordering that to then bring a mountain-like construct out of that in which he puts a garden and his image bearers in it, and they dwell with God. That's what the premise and the climax of creation is in and of itself. And that, of course, is the context in which God ordains this union between these two image bearers that represent the duality of God in human form, right? So to undo that through adultery is to basically bring all of this down back to what it starts out as. Primordial chaos, which in other contexts represents and is equal to death. Hence the reason why capital punishment for adultery. Same thing with practicing incest with a family member because, well, I think it's self-explanatory. Anyway, and then of course, the last thing, distinguish the clean from the unclean, because the idea is that it's not just being ritualistically clean through clean by maintaining proper observance of these laws, and if I sin unintentionally, then that unintentional, unwitting sin creates defilement that's got to be taken care of. But even my moral rebellion, in the sense that if I do something like commit adultery, that too brings defilement. Some forms of defilement can be atoned for, others cannot be. Not in this system, at least. But it brings consequences in and of itself through the defilement that's brought upon the land. Hence the reason why they are to understand very clearly, without any measure of ambiguity, what is considered clean, what is unclean, what is holy, what is profane or common. They all are responsible and in every way culpable for delineating the differences between the two. Why? Because God will hold them accountable to that. Why? Because He wants them to be different than the people He is kicking out of the land, as He is bringing in a new and peculiar people to occupy the land. He is going to use them to grade up that space and plant them as a new vine to bring fruit that is going to bless the nations through. That cannot happen if they themselves become tainted. All right. So, fast and furious, but that's how we do it. So, any questions, comments, especially about the Day of Atonement? Anything there that we need to kind of wrap up? All right. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you.